Hello, everybody. I'm delighted to welcome you to IOB Regulatory Insights session. I'm delighted today to be joined by Marion Kelly. Marion will be well known to many of you. She is the CEO of the Irish Banking Culture Board. So a little bit about Marion before we hand over to her. But Marion joined the Irish Banking Culture Board when it was established in 2018. She was the acting CEO and then appointed the CEO in March 2020. Before that, Marion spent time with Bank of Ireland and she held a range of roles, senior leadership roles there. In particular, she was in the regulatory compliance, operational risk, internal audit and recovery and resolution planning. Prior to her role in Bank of Ireland, she trained in PwC and was there for several years. Marion has also undertaken various other courses and training since then, but we'll touch on those later in the programme. So Marion, I'm absolutely delighted to have you join us here today. I've given a very small sketch of your bio, but I'm sure the listeners would love to hear about your background and yourself, how you evolved through your career and how you've arrived at where you are today.
Okay, thanks, Evelyn. Well, I suppose just very briefly, when I finished university, I went to Brussels, originally to work for the European Commission. I worked with them for a year, and then my career, I suppose, in financial services started then. I started working with a group called the European Savings Banks Group in Brussels, which represent banks which have a they're more regionally active banks. We don't really have any of them in Ireland. There were a number of years ago, but you may have heard of the Caisse or the Sparkassen in Germany. So they were those types of banks. So I started working there and I worked there for a number of years. And then I moved back to Dublin after 5 years in Brussels. And I joined PwC in the consulting area, financial services consulting, and very focused on banking. And I suppose my role there over the 6 years that I was in PwC ranged from bank license applications. There was a lot of them at the time from different types of entities looking to move into Ireland, to regulatory inspections, compliance reviews, AML, prudential issues, Basel, all those types of things. And through that work, I got to know Bank of Ireland. They would have been one of my clients. And that led me to join Bank of Ireland back in 2006. I originally joined Bank of Ireland corporate banking. And in fact, all my time in Bank of Ireland was spent on that side of the bank, the wholesale side of the bank. So corporate banking, global markets, which is sort of the treasury function of the bank. And at the time, we also had asset management and other things as part of the bank's suite of services. So I worked there. I was head of compliance. Then I took on sort of a wider risk management role in terms of compliance, operational risk. As you mentioned, I then moved into recovery and resolution planning. So I headed up that for the group for a number of years. I also did quite a long stint, a couple of years in internal audit. Across the capital market side of the business. And I suppose the latter 2 years of my role in Bank of Ireland before I changed to my current role, culture was becoming more and more to the fore. So the central bank had started their behaviour and culture reviews, and I would have been involved in the bank's response to those queries and the inspection and so on. And it was just something that I became really interested in. You know, it's very related to risk management, but it's wider than that. Obviously, it touches every aspect of the bank's operations and its strategy and so on. So it was something I just became very interested in. And through that, then I became aware of an opportunity to be seconded from Bank of Ireland to help set up the Irish Banking Culture Board. And that's what led me to my current role.
Wow, Marion, it's incredible how all those individual things have come together to stand you now today in the role that you're doing today. But a really varied career and a brave enough move, actually moving to Brussels at the time. That was, you know, quite different in the day. So obviously really set you up well for coming back. So you've just finished there in where you are at in your current role. And the Irish Banking Culture Board, you know, relatively recently established in 2019. You've been there literally from day one and almost before, knowing why. So maybe just share with us now just to position the board, its purpose, its strategy, tell us about it. What is its purpose? And I suppose maybe leading back to what you've just touched on, why was it established?
Okay, so the Irish Banking Culture Board was the idea to set it up started back in 2017, 2018. And listeners are probably aware that was the height of the tracker mortgage reviews and focus by the regulator, by the media, by politicians, etc. And it was very clear that there had been a fundamental failing in behaviour and culture, frankly, within retail banking in Ireland. And that compounded by, I suppose, the behaviour during the financial crisis. There was a real sort of crisis of trust within the industry. Mm-hmm. And at the time you had, as I said, a lot of external regulatory and political and media focus, but you also had a lot of focus in the banks themselves. And you had a change in leadership really across the board, across the 5 retail banks, and a really strong recognition that the industry needed to do something to show they were really serious about behaviour and cultural change, and that they wanted to be seen to be different going forward. So this was part of the steps to really try and show the public and customers and all the various stakeholders in banking that the sector was serious about change. So the Irish Banking Culture Board was set up. It's the 5 retail banks that we had and we still currently have in Ireland. So AIB, Bank of Ireland, KBC, Ulster Bank and Permanent TSB came together to fund and establish the entity. And what was very important from the outset was that notwithstanding that it was funded by the industry, that we needed to show that we were independent. Mm-hmm. And the way to go about that was to appoint a chairman and the members of the board completely independently of the sector, and that was done. So there was a very independent process to look for and appoint a chairman of the board. It was publicly advertised. It was run completely independently of the banks. And through that process, Mr. Justice John Hedigan, a former judge of the Court of Appeal and of the European Court of Human Rights, was appointed to be chair of the entity. I, at the time, was the acting CEO. I was still on the comment from Bank of Ireland. And through that process, then myself and the chair, with another independent body, which included our patron, who is Dr. Martin McAleese, we went about the process of trying to see who should be on the board in terms of the various views that need to be represented around the table. And it was very clear to us from the outset that if you want to show that you're serious about behaviour and cultural change, you needed to have all of the stakeholders, the relevant stakeholders sitting around the table. And at the same time, you needed to have a board that wasn't, completely huge and that would be difficult to manage. So what we set about doing was looking to see how could consumers be represented, how could business interests be represented, how could staff be represented, and then other views in terms of key stakeholders in banking. And that led us to setting up our board, which is 14 members, and I can talk about that in a minute, but it's very varied and it does represent the various stakeholders in banking. So our overall purpose and the goal of the Irish Banking Culture Board is to be a key player that will advocate for behaviour and cultural change in banking, working very closely with our member banks, and also through that process look to try and help the banks restore a certain level of public trust. That trust was lost through a number of different issues like tracker, like other things, and a key goal of the industry is to try and regain that public trust, and we work with the industry to try and do that.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. And I mean, obviously, customer outcomes are at the heart of that and the heart of what we do in IOB ourselves. So I suppose in doing that, you brought together the stakeholders and you then, I suppose, to further demonstrate that independence, I believe, both back at the outset and now again, you've undertaken surveys. So you've gone out to the various other people involved, which are primarily the public and the staff, to get their views and to understand from them. So maybe just give us a little bit of colour of the surveys that you undertook in the initial outset in 2018. And I think you've recently just published your results of your second set of surveys. So maybe talk us a little bit more about them and about why you did them and what they are, and then we might delve into them a little bit more.
Okay, so again, maybe just to go back to 2018 when we were looking to set up the Culture Board, a big consideration for us was to listen to the views of staff and of customers. We didn't want to just go about creating something and then say, we've come up with this great idea. We really wanted to listen to the views of the public and of staff. I think that's really important in any cultural change initiative, that you listen and you take on board the views of those who are impacted. So that's what we did. We did a staff survey back in 2018 when we were in the process of establishing, and that was across all of the staff in our member banks, asking them questions about how they felt about the internal day-to-day culture within the institution in which they worked. So that covered things like speaking up, decision making, how were ethics put into practice, how were the stated values lived in the day-to-day decisions that were made by the organisation, how they felt about things like diversity and inclusion. So a wide range of topics which sort of underpin culture and behaviour. And then we also did a public and stakeholder consultation. So we went out and spoke to the public and spoke to various different stakeholders about what their current impression was of banking, how they felt banks treated customers, what needed to change, how do they think it should change, etc. So all those pieces of feedback then helped inform what we were focusing on for our first 2 years. So we were formally established in April 2019, so just over 2 years ago. And our work programme, in terms of the types of issues that we've been focusing on, was informed by the findings from those different surveys. So for example, we would have had a work stream very much focused on speaking up and how to improve that across our member banks. We had a work stream on ethics and behaviour and decision making, and then we would have had a series of work streams that were more externally focused, so focusing on things like financial awareness, support for customers in vulnerable positions, communications, etc. So that's what we did with the survey results, and we've been focusing on them, as I say. And then what we have just recently published, so just a number of weeks ago, on the 17th of May, we published the findings of our second round of surveys. So we don't want to do them every year because we want to give time to consider and address the findings and put some actions into place. So for that reason, we decided to do it on a 2-year cycle this time out. So we developed a new staff survey, which we designed ourselves in conjunction with a company called Carrion & Box. So it's very much Irish focused in terms of Irish issues for staff. And we ran that survey with all the staff within our member banks in February, March of this year. So it was clearly a difficult period for people. So we had homeschooling and we had lockdown and the ongoing pressures of the pandemic. And there also were a number of material announcements from banks during the period. So all of that is clearly reflected in the survey findings. And the results again will inform our areas of focus going forward. And I can talk about those in a minute. And then equally, what we did in February and March, we did a new survey of customers of our member banks, and again focusing on trust levels. How are trust levels? Have they changed over the period? What are the issues that cause people concern? Are there areas that people feel have improved since we last spoke about this issue back in 2018 or not? And again, all of the findings have been published, and we'll be using them to inform our work going forward.
Thanks, Marion. So, you talked about the survey, and there's been international surveys done, the Edelman barometer and different things. And I mean, it's not unique to Ireland where there are low levels of trust in banking and that, but just looking at them and maybe looking at, I suppose, what maybe has been achieved in that period. So, I suppose looking at maybe the areas you were hoping to see the changes, and they'd obviously be focused on where you did your where your work plans were based, but where have you seen the areas of biggest improvements? And are there any areas in either of the surveys where you were disappointed with the results?
I think yes to that last question, but maybe just I'll talk about the staff survey first, and then talk about how it relates to the customer facing one. So in terms of the staff survey, what I would say is there's been real and substantial improvement, and that's very clear in the survey results. And I think that's we're really pleased with that for us, and for the effort that staff and our member banks have put into this issue over the last 2 to 3 years. So really substantial improvement in terms of speaking up. And that would have been probed, from a number of different facets. So staff reporting substantially increased levels of trust in the process. So, feeling that it's okay to speak up, that it won't cause you personal repercussions in terms of issues for you and your progression internally, that you'll be protected, that something will actually happen out of it. So that was something that scored particularly poorly the last time. People feeling like, what's the point, because nothing ever changes, and that was something that has definitely improved in the 2 to 3 years since we last surveyed, and people feeling that it was the right thing to do. And what was also interesting this time out is it's not just the more material sort of protected disclosure, whistleblowing type of end of speaking up that people feel more confident to do. It's in just generally feeling that you have a voice. So also, if you see that there's a room for improvement, or there's an opportunity for greater efficiency, people feel more empowered to give their views, and that they'll be listened to. So that was all really positive. Still lots of improvement to be done, but definitely on the right road in terms of that area of focus. Another area which has shown a big improvement since the last survey was around I would describe it as sort of the alignment between the values of an organization, so sort of the stated values that are out there in the purpose statement or whatever, and what people see on a day-to-day basis through decision making. So previously, when we surveyed, people reported a disconnect between the two. And this time out, the results definitely show an improvement there, and staff feeling generally that what is said and what is actually done is much more aligned in terms of an overall purpose and values. So that will be around things like customer-centric, doing the right thing, being aware of social responsibility, supporting staff, fair outcomes for customers, etc. So again, that's very positive. And a really positive for the Irish sector overall is that over 85% of Irish bank staff reported that they felt that their institution did business ethically. And that is way ahead by 9 points with the global benchmark. So that will compare favourably with any country internationally. So all of that is really positive. However, there are areas, of course, that need to still improve. And there were areas that probably were a little bit surprising in terms of the poor results this time out. So while speaking up has improved, there's still a way to go in terms of really embedding it and making sure that it works on an ongoing basis. Some of the poorer scores were around things like accountability. So staff feeling that there needed to be greater levels of accountability and opportunities for them to be more accountable internally. So that's around empowerment and delegating and so on. And that's something that we'll be very much focusing on in the context of SEER as well over the coming years. I suppose the areas that were maybe a little bit surprising, but in hindsight they probably shouldn't have been, but they were a little bit surprising, is the level of stress that staff were reporting. So pressures in terms of, just workload, work-life balance, etc. Issues like the right to disconnect. A lot of those are, I suppose, linked with the reality that we were all living in February and March with, as I said, lockdown and homeschooling, etc., etc. But the level of stress reported by Irish bank staff is quite a bit ahead of the levels that would be reported through the global benchmark that we were using. So definitely an area that we need to focus on and try and understand that and what more can be done. And look, banking is not unique. Every sector, regardless of what industry they're in, has had stress and issues for staff with the reality of what we've all had through the pandemic. But we want to look at it specifically from the bank perspective, and why are the rates higher in Ireland than they might be globally. Maybe it's to do with some operational organizational changes that were announced during the period. Maybe it's something else, but it's something we do want to get under the skin of. Yeah. And then I
No,
suppose
that's really interesting. So I mean, just picking up before we maybe move on to the public survey, but just picking up. So what we're seeing there is that, I mean, the things you talked about, like the speak up, like the decision making, you know, the transparency there, sounds very much that and particularly the piece you mentioned about the alignment with values, and actually seeing that alignment with values. You know, we've seen that in organizations before where there has been, you know, substantial issues and where, you know, there's collapses or there's been, you know, big issues. They are the areas that continue to get called out. You know, they have all the statements, but there isn't the alignment and they're not seen. So it sounds as if the tone from the top and that, you know, is really being sort of, we can see it coming down through the organization, and the employees themselves, staff, are beginning to actually feel that. So that's really positive.
Yeah, that is really positive. Now there's still room for improvement, I think, in how key leaders model the required behaviours, but there certainly has been a substantial improvement since we last surveyed in 2018, which is very positive. And I suppose from our perspective, if you're talking about culture and behavioural change, it has to start from within. You know, that's where it starts from, and that's the only way it can be authentic and sustainable. So from our perspective, it was really great to see those improvements and to try now build on those into the future.
And I suppose that leads to the second survey, which is the public survey. And I suppose if there is that much work to be done within, I suppose maybe we might expect then slightly slower results on the public survey. So how have the results of that come in?
Yeah, and maybe just one last point on the staff survey, because it's linked to the external piece. The score from the staff survey that we were, I think, disappointed with and a little taken aback with, and I certainly know all of our member banks feel the same, is the overall levels of pride that were reported by Irish bank staff in terms of where they work, their industry, the organisation with which they work. It's quite a bit behind the global benchmark. So Irish bank staff feel less proud overall of working in banking than the comparable benchmark. And that very much is driven by external perception and external commentary, etc., about the banking sector and about individual banks. So if I look then at the results of the public and the customer related survey. And to be honest, we weren't expecting a substantial improvement since the last time we surveyed. I mean, it's very obvious that there continues to be continued mistrust. We had a number of issues over the last number of months, which, you know, add to that and maintain that. So it wouldn't have been hugely surprising. However, notwithstanding that, the results are relatively poor. And I suppose the overall message is that, you know, there's a way to go to regain the general public trust in banking, and for the external public and customers to really feel that the change has been made and it's impacting them in the day-to-day outcomes that they're receiving in terms of decision making and so on. You know, in terms of overall trust levels in Irish banking, it's quite a bit lower than the global benchmark. So it's -28. If you look at some other jurisdictions, it's for example, in France, it's +11. In the UK, it's +9. There are countries behind Ireland. So Spain is quite a bit behind Ireland. And really what it's pointing to as we explored the results is the continued overhang of the huge loss of trust that the sector suffered as a result of the financial crisis, and compounded by trackers. It still remains today, and there's a way to go to convince people that it has changed. What is interesting is the results show that people trust the banks, sort of the industry, relatively poorly. But when you ask them about their own specific bank, so ABC Bank that they actually are a customer of, the trust levels are higher. And when you ask them about their local branch or the individuals within the organisation that they deal with, the trust levels are higher again. So it's sort of this industry issue about the banks that remains an overhang, and you know, there remains a way to go to convince people that there has been change, and that's the challenge for us and the industry going forward.
Yeah. No, that's very interesting. And I suppose, you know, you're aware, like, you know, the members of IOB are obviously all these people. So it's good to see that there are positives. I mean, the one thing I suppose that doesn't get called out in all of this, and we'll go on maybe to talk about, you know, COVID-19 and what's happened and the implications, is that the one amazing thing about the financial services sector in Ireland, and in particular the banks, is how seamlessly they have operated through the last 18 months. And you know, that how they have, I suppose, because we haven't seen any negative issues and they've operated so effectively, I suppose we're not even calling that out, but I might call that out because, you know, they are a very fundamental part of how a society functions, and, you know, they have really been seamless in the last 18 months. And I suppose, so that leads me on, I suppose, just away from the survey, but not totally away from the survey. You know, we've come through and are still in and are coming out of our COVID-19 pandemic. It's obviously had a dramatic impact on everybody, but particularly on financial services. It has certainly accelerated digitalization in a way that we couldn't even have imagined maybe 18 months ago. So, and also taking account of, you know, there's a couple of things you've said in this. I'm looking at maybe, you know, what the impact is going to be and how it might change and how we'd emerge and how that might impact on, you know, your own work and what you're going to do. And two things that jump out at me are, one, we have already got a, you know, a cohort working in the sector under a lot of pressure. And two, the results, and I'm not expecting you to answer all of this, two, the results are telling us that the interaction at branch level and at bank level is very good, and yet through digitalization we're potentially going to see a slightly different model. So I'm just wondering, of the changes, do you have any feeling yourself in relation to your own work about how those changes are going to impact what you're going to be doing in the years ahead?
I think I suppose there's a range of things there. You know, in terms of the response to COVID-19 and the overall pandemic, I would agree, you know, the delivery of services seamlessly has been a huge achievement by the sector, and also the number of payment breaks and, you know, how proactively they were offered is a real positive. And, you know, staff from particularly frontline branches and various different areas within banks put a huge effort into making sure that they got across the line for customers who were impacted at the beginning of the pandemic. And I think building on that is really important. So, you know, we're coming hopefully to the end of the beginning of the end, at least, of the pandemic. But there are going to be customers, you know, whether they be business customers or retail customers, who are going to continue to be impacted by COVID and the fallout of it. And I think you know, the support that the banks continue to offer in that space will be really important to demonstrating that banks are, you know, are there for their customers and are willing to support within reason. Clearly, there are commercial decisions that need to be taken, but they need to be taken in a clear and transparent way. So that will be something that we'll be looking at, is how the sector continues to respond to the needs of those who are impacted by the pandemic, and that communications are clear and transparent, and that people understand what's required of them. I suppose the other changes that have happened and will continue to happen as a result of COVID, the two that I would particularly focus on would be, one, just the remote working piece for staff. And, you know, I think we all know that it's unlikely that we're going to go back to the old model, and a lot of people don't want to, and that's fine. But it's how that's going to be managed from a work-life balance, you know, right to disconnect perspective. And that's back to sort of the stress and resilience piece that I spoke about earlier. So they'll be important pieces to address by individual institutions and how they deal with their staff. And there's the whole piece around well-being, etc. there. So that will be an area of focus. And then in terms of the digitalization piece, I think absolutely, you know, the pandemic has accelerated what was already happening in the you know, the increased use of digital delivery of services. And, you know, the fact is that the vast majority of customers want to operate that way. And that's a good thing, and it's making sure that you know, operates well for customers. But the challenge is making sure that those who, for whatever reason, either they don't want to, or they can't, or they don't have good broadband, or for whatever reason, whether it is a, you know, an illness related issue or something, who don't want or can't use digital services in the same way as others, that there are opportunities for them to get their banking delivered in another way, and that they're not forgotten about. So it's the supports that are put in place for those customers will be important for us to focus on, and to make sure that those, for whatever reason, are vulnerable because of this move, are not forgotten about and are supported to make sure that they can get their services delivered. So that will be an area of focus. And I suppose that's related to things like the reduced number of branches. Again, look, that's just the way the sector is going. We're not about trying to turn back time and hold back the innovation within the sector. That's happening, but it's making sure that as that innovation is happening, that those who for whatever reason may be impacted negatively are supported, and that there are alternatives for them, and that will be a key part of our focus as well.
Yeah, and I suppose just even identifying them, because it's not necessarily the cohort you think. Like some of the older cohort have actually taken to digitalization really well.
Absolutely.
My dad is tapping away all day long. So yeah, no, absolutely. So just on a slightly different note then, the establishment of the Culture Board was made up of 5 member banks. And we've seen in the announcements made over the last number of months that we potentially could have significant changes on the number of 5. So do you think that'll impact on your work, or will it add more complexity?
It's definitely going to impact. So we were established by 5 banks, and we have been operating with 5 banks, and our focus has been very much on retail banking in Ireland. We know for definite that one of them is leaving, Ulster Bank, and the future over KBC is not clear as of yet, but it seems that there's a high likelihood that they will also be exiting the market. So how does that impact us? Well, it means that we've gone from 5 to 3. So there is a membership issue, first of all, in terms of our funding and our remit, etc. So we need to look at that. But I also think it's the opportunity to stand back and look at what we're about. Are we purely about retail banking, or are we more about retail financial services? And that's something to look at. And that's not just the banks, but there's other providers who provide retail products to customers in Ireland, and behaviour and culture and customer first, etc., is really important in that context. So we need to look at that. And we also then need to look at the areas of focus going forward. So, Tracker remains, sort of front and center, and making sure that the issues that happened that led to that can't happen again. And we have 2 more material fines which need to be announced in the coming months for the last 2 remaining institutions who are our members. So that will keep that sort of front and center in our work for the coming year. But after that, what are the areas of focus and innovation, and how things like artificial intelligence are balanced with ethical behavior will be things we'll likely be looking at. But we do need to have a fundamental reevaluation of what we're about. So we were originally established in 2019. We gave ourselves a 3-year strategy. We'll be coming to the end of that 3-year strategy sort of this time next year. So it is opportune for us to sort of take a step back and try and see where do we go thereafter, and what is our remit and our area of focus. So we'll be doing that in the coming year.
Yeah, and we'll be following you very closely on that. You touched on, on the ethical side of things, and I know you issued your ethical dilemma and the framework, which I think has been very well received, and is must just congratulate you. It's a really easy to use framework, so well done on that. So just then, we've talked about the role of financial services in our society and the importance of it, and culture, and how it can be defined, and you've touched on the various things that the banks have done. But I suppose when I look at, and back to the very opening conversation, when we look at the Culture Board itself, you have a very diverse board, obviously drawn from across industry with a much wider society remit into it. So what have you done, and how have you gone about building your own culture in the Culture Board itself? And what did you find, and how have you been effective as establishing that culture?
That was a big challenge, to be honest, for us. So we have 14 people on the board, and it's a very diverse group. So just to give you a flavour of it, we have our chairman, who I mentioned, is Mr. Justice John Hedigan, so somebody who came completely from the outside of banking and financial services generally, so would have had no role in that sector previously. We then have a member of the board from each of our 5 founding member banks. So they're there, that's 5. And then all other people on the board, so the majority of people on the board are non-bank. So just to give you a flavour of that, we have on the consumer side, Angela Black, who would have been at the time the CEO of the Citizens Information Bureau, and aligned with MABS, for example. We have Padraig Hassan, who'd be very well known to people as the person who was very front and centre in terms of tracker mortgages. Philip O'Leary from the Legal Aid Board, again, very aligned with the consumer cause. So they sort of represent the consumer cohort. Then we have representatives of the SME sector through Sue O'Neill, and from the farming sector through Martin Stapleton, who's the treasurer of the IFA. We also have the Financial Services Union represented through their Secretary General, John O'Connell, and that's very much the staff side. And then we also have an academic, Professor Blana Clark, who is the Chair of Corporate Governance and Competition Law in Trinity College Dublin. So a very wide mix of backgrounds, of interests. And to be honest, you know, a lot of those people would never have sat in the same room before, not even been on a board where we're trying to work collectively together, but they wouldn't even have sat in the same room together before. And I think a big part of cultural change, wherever you are, is that you need to bring the various stakeholders together into the one room, otherwise you're not going to achieve anything. If you're off in one room and then you have to go and liaise, it's much better to bring everybody together. So that was our premise from the outset. But that did bring challenges, because clearly there was a lack of trust around the table. People didn't know each other. There was a sort of a sense of, how genuine are the banks about doing this? And equally from the banking side, there would have been, a slight apprehension about how the various other stakeholders were going to deal with the banks through this board. So a big part of our approach at the beginning was really trying to build trust around the table, and we did a number of things. We would have brought people in from the Institute of Bankers, for example, to come in and talk about the challenges in banking from an independent perspective, so that everybody around the table understood them. So things like the capital requirements for banks, issues around interest rates in Ireland, why they're different to other countries. So to have an independent voice explain the facts, as opposed to people feeling, well, this is the banks putting a spin on things. So that was helpful. We also had people, again, from the Institute of Bankers who came in to talk about just behaviour and culture generally, and how do you build trust amongst teams. So Dr. Vika Schulten came in with some of her colleagues and spoke about some of the issues. And then what we did after our first year, we did a board effectiveness review. And that was very helpful in terms of giving people the opportunity to reflect on the first year, what worked well, what didn't work well, what would we like to change collectively. So all of that has helped. The other thing that we've done is, through our work groups that we have established, we get our board members involved in each of those, so they have the opportunity to work with each other and get to know each other, and that does build trust. One of the difficulties that we've had, and any company really has had that over the past year, is just the remote working piece has probably set us back a little bit, because it is difficult to get to know each people properly through Zoom. It's been great in many ways, but it has, it has caused a little bit of an issue as well. So, we very much are looking forward getting back to face-to-face meetings, giving people the opportunity to meet and to discuss. But I think really, what we try to do is to make, give everybody the opportunity to articulate why they want to be on this board, what are they trying to achieve through it. If people have an issue that they're concerned about or worried about, they always have the opportunity to put it on the board agenda to be discussed. And certainly what we have found is that over the last 2 years, there has been a level of trust that has built up around the table, and people respect each other's views, even though they might be completely different. They respect each other's views, and they also empathize with each other. They empathize with the difficult situation. It wasn't easy. Jane Howard is our member from Ulster Bank, who sits on our board. Clearly that's very difficult for her, that the bank is leaving. It's very difficult for her staff. It's very difficult for the customers. And we have the trade union represented on our board, and we have the customer views represented on our board. But the empathy is there, recognizing that this is a difficult decision for everyone. And what we try and do as the Irish Banking Culture Board is to try and see, okay, a commercial decision has been made. We're all very disappointed with it, but how can we work collectively together to make sure that what happens for staff and for customers through that process is fair and transparent and lives up to the values that we're trying to promote, and that's part of our challenge. So that's one of the things that we'll be looking at, very much into the coming year, is how can material changes like that in the marketplace be managed in a way that is aligned to good culture and good behaviour, and that's all around building trust. So it's not easy, but that would be an area of focus for us. But
no, you've obviously achieved a huge amount, because I mean, like as you said, with a diverse group as you have, to have done the amount of work that you've done already on the surveys and the dilemma framework and everything, that is, you've achieved a huge amount. So I'm listening to all the things you've done, and I suppose my question on, there's a lot of different facets in developing culture, and I was going to ask you, obviously coming from an IOB perspective, what role do you feel that education and training has to play? And I know you yourself are a great advocate of that, so maybe just give me a few minutes on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think just from, a personal perspective, I think it's really important to always challenge yourself and to be looking to learn new skills. And it's also really good just in terms of networking and getting to know people in the industry, and understanding the issues that they're dealing with and how they're approaching things. That's always been very beneficial to me. And I think from a behaviour and culture perspective, it's important to support your staff to do that as well, to upskill and to learn about new approaches to things. So certainly, as you said, I've been a strong advocate of
you're being modest here now, as I know you've done a lot yourself.
I've done the Certified Bank Director course with yourselves, and I also did the professional certificate in leading cultural change and ethics, and both of those I really, really enjoyed. And to be honest, the best thing for me out of both of those was the networks that I built. And being able to talk to people about different issues and how they approach them. I've also just recently done something on sustainability, which is, I think, really interesting and wide-ranging topic. So I think it's really important to continue to, try and learn new skills, understand how different people are approaching things, because it's something you can always bring back then to base and apply it. And as I say, it's important to support staff to do that, so that they, that they feel that they're being invested in, and that you have their best interests at heart in terms of trying to develop and learn.
Well, you certainly seem to not only have done it, but also implemented it. So well done you. So listen, coming to the end now, I suppose, you've touched on a few times about, what's going to happen in the future, but what are your current objectives for the year ahead?
Our objectives for the year ahead would be really taking all of these survey results that we've just completed at the beginning of May, and trying to identify what the priority areas of focus should be. We're a very small entity. There's only a certain amount that we can do. We can do ourselves. Other things are really more within the gift of the individual banks themselves, or it might be their industry body, the BPFI, or indeed it might be yourselves. So what we'll be doing is taking the very detailed results that we have now and prioritising them in terms of what areas we really want to focus on. Some of them will fit very neatly under our existing programme of work and the different work streams that we have in place, whether it's around, as I said, issues for customers in a vulnerable position, financial awareness, communications, speaking up, ethics and behaviour, and so on. But some of them may require new areas of focus, so we just need to consider that. So that will be that's an absolute priority for the coming months, is to look at those results and try and see how we're going to look to address them. And then the second piece is that piece that you mentioned, is that the Irish retail banking market is changing, and we need to prepare for that and consider how does that impact us and how does it impact the wider sector. And then probably the third thing is COVID. And as we move now out of hopefully the worst of it, there are going to be implications for different types of customers. So what is our role in making sure that the industry is supporting staff and customers for fair outcomes, and what can we do in that space? So they're the kind of the areas of focus for us for the coming period.
Well, Marion, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I think you've been incredibly brave taking on this role, because it's new and it's there's a lot of big challenges, but you obviously seem very excited by it and very determined to make change and make things happen. So I'd just like to say well done on that. Wish you the best in the year ahead, and really look forward to catching up with you again to see how this year will have gone. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.